The rain was coming down hard that October evening when Robert walked through the heavy glass doors of the Steinway Concert Hall. Water dripped from his old brown jacket onto the shiny marble floor, leaving a small trail behind him. He looked around at the grand entrance with its high ceilings and crystal chandeliers, feeling completely out of place. This was one of those buildings that made you feel small. Everything was polished and perfect. The kind of place where people whispered instead of talked, where every footstep echoed. Robert wiped his wet shoes on the mat and headed toward the registration desk, clutching a crumpled envelope with his entry documents. The woman behind the desk looked up from her computer and gave him a quick glance. Her eyes moved from his worn jacket to his paint-stained fingers, then back to his face. She didn't smile. "Can I help you?" she asked in that tone people use when they think you're lost. "I'm here for the piano competition," Robert said quietly. "International piano competition. I'm registered." The woman's eyebrows went up slightly. She looked at him again, this time more carefully, as if trying to figure out if he was joking. "Name? Robert Chen." She typed something into her computer, frowning at the screen. Then she typed some more. "Can you spell your last name?" He spelled it out. She clicked her mouse a few times, still frowning. "And you're competing? In the piano competition?" "Yes, ma'am." She stared at the screen for another long moment, then picked up a phone and spoke quietly to someone. Robert couldn't hear what she was saying, but he saw her glance at him twice during the conversation. When she hung up, she asked to see his identification and entry confirmation. He handed them over with hands that were rough from years of manual work. After checking everything twice, she finally printed out a badge and handed it to him. "Green room is down that hall, second door on the left." Her tone suggested she still wasn't convinced he belonged there. Robert thanked her and walked down the corridor, his shoes making squeaking sounds on the polished floor. He could feel her watching him as he went. The green room was buzzing with energy when he pushed open the door. It was full of young people, most of them looking like they were in their 20s, maybe early 30s at most. They wore expensive clothes and carried themselves with the kind of confidence that comes from years of training and success. Designer bags sat next to instrument cases. Several people were doing finger exercises in the air, their hands moving in quick, precise patterns. Robert found an empty chair in the corner and sat down quietly. He was 47 years old, and right now he felt every single year of it. A young man with perfectly styled hair was talking loudly about his recent performance at some famous venue in Vienna. A woman with a French accent was discussing her training under a master whose name Robert had only read about in library books. Two others were comparing notes about their conservatory programs, throwing around terms like interpretation technique and dynamic phrasing. Nobody looked at Robert. Or rather, a few people looked, but their eyes just slid right past him, as if he were part of the furniture. He pulled off his damp jacket and hung it on the back of his chair. Underneath, his shirt was clean but old, the collar slightly frayed. His pants had a small paint stain near the knee that he'd tried to wash out, but couldn't quite remove completely. These were his good clothes, the ones he saved for special occasions. But next to these other competitors, he might as well have been wearing rags. Robert closed his eyes and flexed his fingers slowly, one at a time. These hands had painted hundreds of houses over the years. They'd held brushes and rollers, scraped old wallpaper, sanded rough wood until it was smooth. They were strong hands, working hands, but could they do what he needed them to do tonight? For the past 2 years, he'd been practicing 4 hours every night after coming home from work. He'd bought a second-hand electronic keyboard from a pawn shop for $75. It sat in his small studio apartment next to the kitchen table. Most nights he was so tired his eyes could barely stay open, but he practiced anyway. He watched tutorial videos on his phone, read books from the library, listened to recordings of the great pianists until he could hear every note in his sleep. A burst of laughter made him open his eyes. 3 young competitors near the window were looking at something on a phone, smiling and shaking their heads. One of them glanced over at Robert, said something quietly to the others, and they all looked his way. More smiles. One covered her mouth, trying not to laugh out loud. Robert looked down at his hands. Let them laugh. He'd heard worse. An older gentleman in a suit entered the room carrying a clipboard. "Listen up, everyone," he announced. "We're about to begin the preliminary round. When I call your name, please proceed to the stage entrance. Remember, you'll have exactly 8 minutes for your performance. The judges will stop you if you go over time. He started reading names from his list. One by one, the young competitors stood up, grabbed their things, and walked out with the kind of easy confidence that made it look simple. This was their world. They belonged here. Robert waited, his heart beating faster with each name called. Robert Chen. He stood up, his legs feeling stiff. As he walked toward the door, he heard a soft snicker from somewhere behind him. Then a whispered comment he couldn't quite make out, followed by more quiet laughter. The stage entrance was down a narrow hallway. Robert could hear applause from inside the concert hall as the previous performer finished. His mouth felt dry. His hands, which had been steady all day at work, were suddenly trembling slightly. A stage manager with a headset looked at him. "You're next. Wait here until I give you the signal." Through a gap in the curtain, Robert could see the stage. The piano sat in a pool of light, a beautiful black grand piano that probably cost more than he'd earned in the last 5 years. The seats beyond were filled with people. Important people. People who knew music, who could tell the difference between good and great, between passion and technique. What was he doing here? He was a house painter who'd taught himself piano from videos. He'd never had a real lesson in his life. He'd never performed in front of anyone except his late wife, and she'd loved everything he played because she loved him. The stage manager touched his arm. "You're on." Robert took a deep breath and walked through the curtain onto the stage toward that beautiful piano and the 3 judges who sat at a table in front of the first row. Their faces were neutral, professional, but he could see it in their eyes. The same look the registration woman had given him. The same look those young competitors had given him in the green room. They'd already decided. They were just being polite, going through the motions. In their minds, he'd already failed. Well, he thought as he approached the piano, let's see about that. The lights were bright, much brighter than Robert had expected. He could feel the heat of them on his face as he walked across the stage. His shoes made soft sounds on the wooden floor, and in the quiet hall, those sounds seemed loud enough for everyone to hear. The piano waited for him like an old friend, though he'd never played one this expensive before. His keyboard at home had weighted keys that tried to feel like a real piano, but this was different. This was the real thing, a Steinway Grand, its black surface so polished he could almost see his reflection in it. Robert reached the bench and stood there for a moment, looking at the keys. White and black, arranged in the same pattern they'd been for centuries. It didn't matter if you were rich or poor, trained or self-taught. The keys were the same for everyone. That thought calmed him a little. He sat down and immediately knew something was wrong. The bench was too high. He reached underneath to adjust it, his fingers fumbling with the mechanism. It took him longer than it should have. He could feel hundreds of eyes on his back waiting. Someone in the audience coughed. He finally got the bench to the right height and sat again. Better. But now his hands were shaking more than before. Robert looked out at the audience, though the lights made it hard to see much beyond the first few rows. He could make out the judges clearly, though. 3 of them, sitting at a long table with water bottles and notepads in front of them. The woman in the middle had gray hair pulled back in a tight bun. The man on the left wore glasses that caught the light. The younger man on the right was already writing something on his notepad, and Robert hadn't even played a single note yet. He turned back to the piano. This was it. This was what Helen had wanted for him. His wife had believed in him when nobody else did, not even himself. 2 years ago, when the cancer was winning and they both knew it, she'd made him promise. "Stop making excuses," she'd said, her voice weak but determined. "You've got music in you that needs to come out. Promise me you'll try," he'd promised, and when she passed, he'd sold her engagement ring to pay for this competition entry fee. It had nearly killed him to do it, but he knew she would have understood. She would have insisted, actually. Robert placed his hands on the keys. They felt cool under his fingertips. Smooth. Perfect. He was going to play Chopin's Nocturne in C-sharp minor. He'd practiced it 1,000 times, maybe more. He knew every note, every pause, every crescendo. But knowing it and performing it in front of judges and an audience were 2 completely different things. His hands hovered over the keys. He needed to start. Any second now. But his mind had gone blank. Where did the piece begin? What were the first notes? The silence stretched out. Someone in the audience shifted in their seat. He heard the distinct sound of a program rustling. The judge with glasses glanced at the woman with the gray bun, and Robert saw her give a tiny shrug. Then, somewhere in his memory, he heard Helen's voice. Not the weak voice from the hospital, but her strong voice from years ago, when they were young and everything seemed possible. "Just feel it," she used to say when he got frustrated with his practice. "Stop thinking so much. Just feel the music." Robert closed his eyes, took a breath, and let his fingers drop to the keys. The first notes came out softer than he'd intended. Tentative, like he was asking a question instead of making a statement. But they were the right notes, and once he started, muscle memory took over. His hands knew what to do, even if his brain was still catching up. The nocturne began to flow. It wasn't perfect. Not even close. There was a moment in the third measure where he hesitated, almost stopped completely. And the trill in the fifth measure came out clumsy. Not crisp like it should have been. He knew the judges caught it. He knew everyone caught it. But something else was happening too. As he played, Robert stopped thinking about the judges. He stopped thinking about the other competitors in the green room who'd laughed at him. He stopped thinking about his paint-stained fingers and his old clothes and how he didn't belong here. He thought about Helen instead. He thought about their tiny apartment with the leaky faucet and the view of the parking lot. He thought about Sunday mornings when he'd play for her on that cheap keyboard, and she'd sit at their kitchen table with her coffee, eyes closed, smiling. He thought about the nights when money was tight and things were hard, but they had each other, and that was enough. He thought about the last time he'd played for her, in the hospital room, humming the melody because there was no piano there, and how she'd squeezed his hand and said, "Beautiful." All of that went into the music. Every memory, every feeling, every moment of love and loss and longing. The notes became more than just technical exercises. They became a conversation, a prayer, a goodbye letter written in sound. The judge with the gray bun sat up straighter in her chair. Robert didn't see it because his eyes were still closed, but she'd noticed something. The other judges noticed her reaction and listened more carefully. In the audience, people who'd been checking their phones or reading their programs looked up. The nocturne wasn't being played perfectly, but it was being played honestly. And that was something different. That was something you didn't hear every day, even at prestigious competitions. Robert's hands moved across the keys with increasing confidence. Yes, there were mistakes. A missed note here, a timing issue there. But between the mistakes, there were moments of genuine beauty. Moments where the music seemed to come from somewhere deeper than technique, somewhere beyond what could be taught in any conservatory. The piece moved into its middle section, the part Robert had always found most difficult. His fingers stretched for the larger intervals, and he could feel the strain. These weren't the young, flexible fingers of a 20-year-old who'd been training since childhood. These were the hands of a middle-aged man who'd spent his day painting the exterior of a house in the suburbs, who'd only started seriously playing piano 2 years ago. But they were also the hands of someone who'd lived, who'd loved and lost, who'd struggled and survived, and somehow, impossibly, that came through in the music. The audience had gone completely still. No more coughing, no more wrestling programs. Even the judge who'd been writing notes had stopped. His pen hovering over the paper, Robert played the final section, the part where the melody returns but softer, sadder, like a memory that's starting to fade. His touch on the keys became lighter, more delicate. He was saying goodbye now, not to the piece but to Helen, to the life they'd had together, to the dreams they'd shared. The last chord hung in the air for a moment before fading into silence. Robert opened his eyes. His hands were still on the keys, trembling slightly. He'd done it. He'd actually done it. It wasn't perfect, but it was real. For a moment, nothing happened. The hall was completely quiet. Robert wondered if that was bad, if maybe he'd messed up worse than he thought. Then, slowly, someone started clapping. It was hesitant at first, just one person. Then another joined in. Then a few more. Within seconds, the whole audience was applauding. Robert stood up from the bench, his legs unsteady. He gave a small bow, the way he'd seen performers do in videos. The applause continued, and he could see people in the front rows nodding at him, actually nodding with respect. He walked off the stage in a daze, barely aware of where he was going. The stage manager had to guide him back to the green room. When he pushed through the door, the other competitors looked at him differently than before. The laughter was gone. Instead, there was something else in their faces. Curiosity, maybe, Or surprise. The young man who'd been talking about Vienna earlier caught his eye and gave him a slight nod. Not friendly exactly, but not dismissive either. It was acknowledgement, recognition. Robert sat down in his corner chair and put his face in his hands. His whole body was shaking now, the adrenaline draining away. He'd done it. Against all odds, against everyone's expectations including his own. He'd gotten through it, and maybe, just maybe, he'd shown them something worth remembering. Robert sat in the green room for what felt like hours, though it was probably only 20 minutes. His heart was still racing, his hands still trembling. He kept replaying the performance in his mind, hearing every mistake, every hesitation. But he also remembered the applause. That had been real, hadn't it? The other competitors continued their performances, one after another. Each time someone returned from the stage, Robert tried to read their faces. Some looked satisfied. Others looked disappointed. None of them spoke to him yet, but the mocking glances had stopped completely. During the intermission, Robert stepped out into the hallway to get some air. His throat was dry and he needed to move, to do something with the nervous energy still buzzing through his body. He found a water fountain and took a long drink, the cold water helping to clear his head. "Excuse me." Robert turned around. A young woman stood behind him, waiting for the fountain. She had dark hair pulled into a ponytail and wore an elegant black dress. He recognized her from the green room, one of the competitors who'd been sitting near the window. "Sorry," he said, stepping aside. She took a drink, then straightened up and looked at him. "You're Robert Chen, right? You played the Chopin Nocturne." "Yeah, that's me." He waited for her to say something dismissive, something about his mistakes. Instead, she held out her hand. "I'm Anna Volkova. I'm competing too." He shook her hand, surprised by the gesture. "Nice to meet you." "That was really something," she said. "Your performance, I mean. The way you played that piece. Where did you study?" Robert felt his face grow warm. Here it was, the question he'd been dreading. "I didn't study, I mean. Not formally. I taught myself." Anna's eyes widened. "You're self-taught?" "Seriously?" "Yeah, videos mostly. Library books. Whatever I could find." She stared at him for a moment, processing this information. "But the way you interpreted the nocturne, the emotion in it, that's not something you can just learn from videos." Robert shrugged, uncomfortable with the attention. "I just played what I felt, I guess." "It showed," Anna said quietly. Then she smiled. A genuine smile that reached her eyes. "I've been training since I was 4 years old. Conservatory in Moscow, then Juilliard. 15 years of lessons from the best teachers money can buy. And you know what? I heard something in your performance that I've been trying to find in my own playing for years." "What's that?" "Honesty," she said simply. "You weren't trying to impress anyone. You were just playing. Really playing. From here." She tapped her chest over her heart. Robert didn't know what to say to that. Before he could respond, a man in a suit approached them. He was older, maybe in his 60s, with a kind face and silver hair. "Mr. Chen?" The man asked. "Yes?" "I'm David Park, one of the competition organizers. Could I speak with you for a moment?" Robert's stomach dropped. This was it. They were going to tell him there'd been some mistake, that he shouldn't have been allowed to compete, that he needed to leave. Anna gave him an encouraging nod and walked back toward the green room. "Is something wrong?" Robert asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Wrong? No, not at all," Mr. Park said, looking confused. Then his expression cleared. "Oh, you thought you were in trouble." No, nothing like that. I wanted to ask you about your background. Your application was quite brief. It says here you work as a house painter?" "Yes, sir." "That's right. And you started playing piano when?" "Seriously? About 2 years ago. I mean, I'd messed around with it when I was younger, but I couldn't afford lessons back then. Grew up in foster care. Never really had the chance until recently." Mr. Park nodded slowly, writing something on the small notepad he carried. "What made you decide to enter this competition?" "It's quite prestigious. Most of our competitors have been preparing for years, even decades." Robert thought about Helen, about the promise he'd made. "My wife passed away 2 years ago. Before she died, she made me promise I'd stop putting my life on hold. She always believed I had something to offer, even when I didn't believe it myself. So I started practicing. Every night after work, no matter how tired I was. And this competition, I saw the announcement at the library and I thought, why not? The entry fee was expensive, but I figured if I didn't try now, I never would. I'm sorry for your loss, Mr. Park said gently. She must have been a remarkable woman. She was. Well, I think she'd be very proud of you today. The judges were quite moved by your performance. Very impressed, actually. You're advancing to the semifinals. Robert felt like the floor had just dropped out from under him. I'm what? Advancing. You made it through the preliminary round. Mr. Park smiled. Did you think you hadn't? I made so many mistakes, Robert said, still in shock. The trill in the fifth measure was terrible, and I hesitated in the middle section, and Mr. Park held up a hand. Technical perfection isn't everything, Mr. Chen. Yes, you made some errors, but you also demonstrated something that can't be taught. Musicality, emotional depth, the ability to tell a story through sound. Those qualities matter just as much, sometimes more. He paused. The judges want to see what else you can do. After Mr. Park walked away, Robert stood in the hallway alone, trying to process what had just happened. He'd advanced. He was going to the semifinals. It didn't seem real. He pulled out his phone and stared at the screen. For a moment, he almost called Helen's number, forgetting she was gone. The realization hit him like it always did, a fresh wave of grief even after 2 years. He'd never be able to share this moment with her. Never hear her excited voice telling him she knew he could do it, but maybe she knew anyway, wherever she was. Robert returned to the green room to find it buzzing with conversation. The preliminary results had been posted. Out of 32 competitors, only 12 were advancing. He found his name on the list, number 7. Above him were names from famous music schools, people with impressive credentials. Below him were more of the same, and there he was. Robert Chen, house painter, self-taught pianist, advancing to the semifinals of an international competition. Anna caught his eye from across the room and gave him a thumbs up. A few other competitors nodded at him with newfound respect, but not everyone was happy about his advancement. He could see 2 young men in the corner, both in expensive suits, talking quietly and glancing his way. Their expressions made it clear they thought his advancement was a fluke, maybe even unfair. One of them, a tall guy with slicked-back hair, walked over. Congratulations on advancing, he said, though his tone suggested he meant the opposite. Thanks, Robert replied carefully. I'm curious, the young man continued. How long did you prepare for this competition? I've been working on my semifinal piece for 8 months. I've been practicing for about 2 years total. The young man laughed, a sharp sound without humor. 2 years. That's adorable. I've been training for 22 years. Since I was 3 years old. He leaned in slightly. You got lucky today. The judges felt sorry for you, probably. Gave you the sympathy vote. But the semifinals? That's different. That's where technical skill matters. That's where the real musicians separate from the hobbyists. Robert felt anger flash through him but pushed it down. Maybe you're right, he said quietly. Guess we'll find out. The young man smirked and walked away. Anna appeared at Robert's side. Don't listen to him. That's Christopher Wellington. His father donated a new wing to the music building at his conservatory. He's used to getting what he wants. He might have a point, though, Robert said. I don't have the training these people have. The semifinals are going to be much harder. So what? Anna said. You made it this far. That means something. And honestly, Christopher can play 1,000 notes perfectly and still never make anyone feel what you made us feel today. She paused. What are you playing for the semifinals? Robert took a deep breath. Rachmaninoff, Piano Concerto No. 2. Anna's eyes went wide. You're kidding. That's one of the hardest pieces in the repertoire. It's what I'm playing, too. I know it's hard, but it's the piece that speaks to me. The piece I want to play. That's either really brave or really crazy, Anna said, but she was smiling. Maybe both. Probably both, Robert admitted. The semifinal round was scheduled for 2 days later. Robert had 48 hours to prepare for the most important performance of his life. He thought about his little keyboard at home, about the countless hours still ahead of him. He thought about Christopher Wellington's smug face and dismissive words, but mostly, he thought about Helen and the promise he'd made, and how he'd come too far to give up now. The 2 days between the preliminary round and the semifinals passed in a blur. Robert barely slept. Every spare moment was spent at his keyboard, practicing the Rachmaninoff concerto until his fingers ached and his mind felt numb. His small apartment echoed with the same passages over and over. the walls thin enough that he worried about disturbing his neighbors. But nobody complained. Maybe they couldn't hear him, or maybe they could and didn't mind. On the morning of the semifinals, Robert woke up at 5 with his heart already pounding. He'd dreamed about the performance, about sitting at that grand piano and forgetting every single note. In the dream, the keys had turned to water under his fingers, and the audience had laughed and laughed until he woke up sweating. He made coffee with shaking hands and sat at his keyboard, not to practice, but just to touch the keys. To remind himself they were real, that he knew this piece, that he'd earned his place here. The competition started at 2 in the afternoon. Robert arrived early before noon, unable to stay in his apartment any longer. The concert hall looked different in daylight, less intimidating somehow, though his stomach still churned with nerves. He found Anna in the practice room running through scales. She looked up when he entered and smiled, though he could see the tension in her face too. "Couldn't stay away either?" she asked. "Too nervous to sit at home," Robert admitted. "Me too. I've played this concerto 100 times, but today feels different." She paused, her hands hovering over the practice piano keys. Bigger somehow. They practiced in comfortable silence for a while, each lost in their own preparation. Other competitors came and went. Christopher Wellington showed up with an entourage, 2 older people who Robert guessed were his parents, and a man who might have been his private instructor. Christopher barely glanced at the other competitors, too focused on his own warm-up routine. At 1:30, an organizer came to gather everyone. The semifinal round would begin promptly at 2. They'd draw numbers to determine the performance order. Robert reached into the bowl and pulled out a slip of paper. Number 4. He'd be performing 4th out of the 12 semifinalists. Anna drew number 10. Christopher got number 12, the final slot. Robert saw him smile at that. Going last meant the audience would remember your performance most clearly. It was an advantage. The first 3 performers were extraordinary. A woman from Japan played a Beethoven piece with such precision it seemed almost mathematical. A man from Germany tackled a Liszt composition that required his hands to fly across the keys at impossible speeds. A young guy from Canada played Chopin with the kind of technical mastery that came from years of intensive training. Robert watched from the wings, his mouth getting drier with each performance. These people were in a different league. What was he thinking, competing against them? Christopher had been right. He was a hobbyist, a house painter who'd taught himself from videos. Then it was his turn. Robert walked onto the stage, and this time the bright lights felt familiar. He'd been here before. He could do this again. The piano waited, that same beautiful Steinway. He sat down, adjusted the bench, took a breath. Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 2, one of the most technically demanding pieces ever written. It required power, delicacy, speed, control, and emotional depth all at once. Most pianists spent years preparing to perform it publicly. Robert had 2 years of total piano experience. He placed his hands on the keys and thought about why he'd chosen this piece. It wasn't just because he loved it, though he did. It was because Rachmaninoff had written it while battling depression, while doubting himself, while wondering if he'd ever create anything worthwhile again. And somehow from that darkness he'd created something beautiful, something that had lasted more than a century. Robert understood that. He understood doubt. He understood feeling like you weren't good enough, like you'd never measure up. But he also understood the need to create anyway, to play anyway, to try anyway. The first chord rang out, deep and resonant. Then his right hand began the famous opening melody, those 8 notes that everyone recognized even if they didn't know classical music. His left hand joined in with the accompanying chords and he was off, diving into the piece like jumping into deep water. The first movement was the hardest, with its cascading runs and powerful crescendos. Robert's fingers stretched and reached, finding notes that seemed impossible. There were moments when he thought he'd lose control, when the tempo threatened to run away from him, but he held on, digging deep into reserves of focus he didn't know he had. His hands were moving almost independently of his conscious thought now, guided by muscle memory and something else, something that came from all those nights of practice, all those hours of listening, all that time spent understanding not just how to play the notes, but what they meant. The concerto told a story. It started in darkness, in struggle. Then it moved through uncertainty, through moments of beauty mixed with pain, and finally it resolved into something like hope. Not easy hope, not the kind that ignored difficulty, but the hard-won hope that came from surviving. Robert played all of that, every struggle he'd faced. Growing up without parents, bouncing between foster homes, working jobs that wore down his body, but never quite broke his spirit. Meeting Helen and finding love, losing her and finding a reason to keep going anyway. All of it poured through his fingers into the keys, into the strings, into the air of that concert hall. The second movement was softer, more introspective. His touch on the keys became gentle, almost a whisper. This was the part where the concerto asked questions instead of making statements. This was where doubt lived. Robert knew doubt intimately, and it showed in every note. Then came the third movement, and with it a return of energy. Faster now, more insistent. The piece was building toward something, driving forward with increasing urgency. Robert's hands flew across the keys, and yes, he made mistakes. He hit a wrong note in a crucial run. His timing wobbled in a difficult passage. But he didn't stop. He pushed through, letting the momentum carry him. The judges noticed every error. They were writing notes, their expressions neutral but attentive. The audience watched in absolute silence, caught up in the performance despite its imperfections. Because that's what Robert had learned in his 2 years of teaching himself piano. Perfection wasn't the point. Connection was the point. Making people feel something was the point. And right now, in this moment, he was making people feel. The concerto built toward its final climax, the part where everything came together. Melody and harmony, power and delicacy, technique and emotion all converging into a series of massive chords that seemed to shake the very air. Robert threw everything he had into those final measures. His whole body moved with the music, swaying and leaning, becoming part of the piano rather than separate from it. And then, with one last powerful chord that rang through the hall like a bell, it was over. Robert sat there for a moment, breathing hard, his hands still on the keys. Sweat dripped down his back. His fingers throbbed. His arms felt like they were made of lead. The silence stretched out for what felt like forever. Then the applause started. Not hesitant this time, not polite. It was immediate and loud, filling the hall with sound. People in the audience rose to their feet. Not everyone, but enough. A standing ovation for a self-taught house painter who'd just performed one of the most difficult pieces in the classical repertoire. Robert stood up on shaky legs and bowed. When he looked at the judges, he saw something he hadn't expected. The woman with the gray bun had tears running down her face. She wasn't hiding them or wiping them away. She just let them fall while she clapped. He walked off stage in a daze, his legs barely holding him up. Hannah was waiting in the wings, and she threw her arms around him without warning. "That was incredible," she said into his shoulder. "That was absolutely incredible." Robert couldn't speak. His throat was too tight with emotion. He'd done it. He'd actually done it. Whatever happened next, whatever the judges decided, he'd stood on that stage and played his heart out in front of hundreds of people. He'd kept his promise to Helen. He'd proven to himself that he could. The remaining semi-finalists performed after him. Anna played beautifully, with technical precision and emotional maturity that showed her years of training. The others were equally impressive, and then Christopher Wellington took the stage for the final performance of the round. Robert had to admit the guy could play. Christopher's technique was flawless, absolutely perfect. Not a single missed note, not one timing issue. His interpretation was exactly what you'd expect from someone who'd studied under the best teachers money could buy. It was textbook, classical safe. It was also, Robert thought, somehow empty, beautiful but hollow, like a perfect shell with nothing inside. When the final applause died down, the organizers announced that results would be posted in 30 minutes. The judges needed time to deliberate. Those 30 minutes felt like 30 hours. Robert paced in the green room, unable to sit still. Anna tried to make conversation, but he could barely focus on her words. His mind kept replaying every mistake he'd made, every wrong note, every timing issue. Finally, an organizer appeared with the results sheet. The room fell silent as she pinned it to the bulletin board. Only 5 competitors would advance to the final round. Robert stood at the back of the crowd, too nervous to push forward and look. He watched the faces of those who could see the list. Some smiled. Others looked devastated. Christopher Wellington looked at the list and nodded once, satisfied. Anna turned around, scanning the crowd until she found Robert's face. She was smiling, actually smiling, and she was pointing at him. He'd made it. Against all odds, despite all his mistakes, he'd made it to the finals. The finals were scheduled for the following evening. One more night, one more performance, and it would all be over. Robert went home that night and didn't practice. His fingers were too sore, his mind too exhausted. Instead, he sat on his small balcony with a cup of tea and watched the city lights flicker in the distance. He thought about how far he'd come. Not just in this competition, but in life. From a kid with nothing, to a man who'd found love, lost it, and somehow kept going. Music had saved him in a way, given him something to hold on to when everything else fell apart. His phone buzzed. A text from Anna. "You're going to do great tomorrow. Try to get some sleep." He smiled and texted back a thank you. It was strange having a friend in this competition. Someone who genuinely seemed to want him to succeed even though they were competing against each other. The next morning, Robert woke up feeling oddly calm. The panic was gone, replaced by something else. Acceptance, maybe. Or just exhaustion. Whatever happened today, he'd already accomplished more than he'd ever dreamed possible. Making it to the finals of an international piano competition. Him, a self-taught house painter. The concert hall was packed for the finals. Every seat filled. Robert stood backstage and peeked through the curtain at the crowd. There were reporters in the back, cameras set up. Someone had told him that his story had gotten out, that people were talking about the amateur pianist who'd made it to the finals. A video of his semi-final performance had been posted online and was getting thousands of views. It felt surreal, overwhelming, like this was happening to someone else and he was just watching. The 5 finalists gathered backstage. Anna was there, looking elegant in a deep blue dress. Christopher Wellington wore an expensive suit and had the confident air of someone who'd already won. The other 2 finalists, a woman from South Korea and a man from Italy, both looked focused and serious. They drew numbers again. Robert got number 3 this time, middle of the pack. Anna would go last. The first finalist, the woman from South Korea, performed a piece by Prokofiev that was technically dazzling. Her fingers moved so fast they were almost a blur. The audience applauded enthusiastically when she finished. The second finalist, the man from Italy, played Schubert with such delicate beauty that it felt like watching someone paint with sound. More applause, maybe even louder this time. Then it was Robert's turn. He walked onto the stage for what might be the last time. The piano waited. The audience watched. The judges sat with their notepads ready. Robert wondered what they saw when they looked at him. Did they see the house painter? The self-taught amateur? Or did they see a pianist? He sat at the bench and placed his hands on the keys. For the finals, he'd chosen to play the same piece he'd opened with, Chopin's Nocturne in C-sharp minor, the piece that had gotten him through the preliminaries. Some people might have called it a safe choice, but Robert knew better. This piece meant something to him. It was where his journey in this competition had begun, and it felt right to let it be where the journey ended. But this time would be different. This time he wasn't nervous or uncertain. He knew every note. He knew exactly what he wanted to say. Robert began to play, and from the first note, something magical happened. All the practice, all the performances, all the emotion of the past few days came together. His fingers found the keys with confidence. The hesitations were gone. The technical errors that had plagued his earlier performance were replaced with something approaching mastery, not perfection. He still wasn't technically perfect, and he never would be. But there was something else there now, something that went beyond technique. The nocturne flowed from the piano like water, like breathing, like the most natural thing in the world. Robert played it the way he'd played it 100 times alone in his apartment, thinking about Helen. But now he was also thinking about everyone who'd ever felt like they didn't belong. Everyone who'd ever been dismissed or overlooked. Everyone who'd ever had a dream they were afraid to chase. He played for all of them. For himself. For Helen. For the kid he'd been in foster care who'd loved music but never thought he'd get to play. For the man he'd become who'd almost given up. For the person he might still become. The audience was completely still. Even the photographers had stopped moving, their cameras momentarily forgotten. The judges weren't writing notes anymore. They were just listening. Robert reached the final section of the piece, the part where the melody returns one last time before fading away. His touch was so light now, so gentle, that the notes seemed to float in the air like whispers. And then, with one last soft chord, he was done. The silence that followed was complete. Total. Robert lifted his hands from the keys and sat there, not moving, barely breathing. Then the hall erupted. The applause was thunderous. Overwhelming. People jumped to their feet immediately, the entire audience rising as one. Robert stood and bowed, and when he looked at the judges, all three of them were standing too. Even the stern man with the glasses who hadn't smiled once during the entire competition was on his feet, clapping. Robert walked off stage with his vision blurred by tears he didn't bother to hide. Anna hugged him again, and this time he hugged her back. That was perfect, she whispered. That was absolutely perfect. Your turn, he said, trying to smile through the tears. Go show them what you've got. Anna did exactly that. Her performance was technically brilliant and emotionally powerful. She'd clearly learned something from watching Robert, because there was a rawness in her playing that hadn't been there before. A willingness to be vulnerable. The audience loved it. Then came Christopher Wellington for the final performance of the competition. He played Liszt, something flashy and incredibly difficult. And he played it perfectly. Every note in place, every timing exact. It was an impressive display of technical skill, the kind of performance that showed years of expensive training. But when it was over, when the applause came, it felt different somehow. Appreciative but not moved. Respectful but not emotional. The judges retired to deliberate. The wait was excruciating. Robert sat with Anna in the green room, neither of them speaking much. What was there to say? Whatever happened now was out of their hands. After what felt like an eternity, the organizers called everyone back to the stage. All 5 finalists stood in a line while the head judge, the woman with the gray bun, stepped up to the microphone. This has been an extraordinary competition, she began. The level of talent we've witnessed over these past few days has been remarkable. Every finalist should be proud of what they've accomplished. She paused, looking at each of them in turn. When her eyes met Robert's, she smiled slightly. The judges have reached a decision. In third place, we have Robert Chen. The audience exploded in applause. Third place. He'd taken third place in an international piano competition. Robert felt his knees go weak. Anna grabbed his arm to steady him as he stepped forward to receive his medal and certificate. Third place. Not first, but third. Out of dozens of competitors, he'd placed third. The woman from South Korea took second place. And first place, as expected, went to Anna. She deserved it. Her performance had been stunning, but something unexpected happened during the awards ceremony. As the medals were presented and photos were taken, Robert noticed something. The crowd's cheers were loudest for him. Not for the winners above him, but for him. People were chanting his name. Robert, Robert. After the ceremony, reporters rushed forward. But they weren't interested in interviewing the first-place winner. They wanted to talk to Robert. How does it feel to place third as a self-taught pianist? One asked. What inspired you to enter the competition? Asked another. What's next for you? Robert answered their questions as honestly as he could. Yes, it felt incredible. Helen had inspired him. As for what was next, he wasn't sure yet. But over the following days, as he returned to his normal life, offers started coming in. A community music center wanted him to teach. A recording studio was interested in making an album. A documentary filmmaker wanted to tell his story. Universities were inviting him to give talks about following your dreams. Robert accepted the teaching position at the community music center. It felt right. He could pass on what he'd learned, help other people who thought they'd missed their chance. On his first day of teaching, he stood in front of a room full of students. They were all adults, all people who'd always wanted to learn piano but thought they were too old or it was too late. They looked at him nervously, waiting to see what this famous competition finalist would say. Robert sat down at the piano and smiled. Let me tell you something, he said. 2 years ago, I didn't know how to play. I worked as a house painter. Everyone dismissed me when I showed up at that competition. They looked at my paint-stained hands and my cheap clothes and decided I didn't belong. He paused, letting that sink in. But I belonged because I showed up. I belonged because I tried. And you belong here too, no matter how old you are, no matter when you're starting. It's never too late to chase something that matters to you. He placed his hands on the keys. Now let me teach you what someone should have taught me years ago. Let's start with the basics. As he began to play, showing them simple scales and exercises, Robert thought about Helen. He thought about that rainy night when he'd walked into the concert hall as a nobody. He thought about standing on that stage, feeling the weight of everyone's doubt, and he thought about how he'd proven them all wrong. Not by being perfect, not by being the best, but by being real, by being himself. By refusing to give up even when giving up would have been easier. That, he realized, was the real victory. Not the medal or the recognition or the opportunities that had come after. The real victory was standing here now, teaching others, sharing what he'd learned, helping people believe in themselves the way Helen had believed in him. The real victory was that he'd stopped dismissing himself. And once he did that, it didn't matter what anyone else thought. He belonged at that piano. He'd earned his place there, and no one could ever take that away.